So shall we start? Ok, bien. Arriba el conteo para el Zoom.
Ya estamos.
¿Ya? Ok. Bien. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. So I would like to welcome you all again to the public session of the conference, Political Polarization, Regional Governance, and Challenges from the Liberal Scripts in Latin America. Undoubtedly, today it is a very relevant topic in Latin America, but also in Mexico. We did not talk much today about Mexico, but yesterday, I guess that all of you, all of our visitors, all of our guests, were able to appreciate that issues related to democratic backsliding are a source of concern for significant sectors of the Mexican electorate, which are ready to mobilize against official decisions that are considered a threat to a healthy democratic regime. At the same time, we also realize that the discourses given by different political actors regarding yesterday's protest reflect also a highly polarized narrative defined by the support or rejection of the government decisions. So I guess that those protests are a sort of liberal contestations of the official contestations of the liberal script. Okay, and evidently, the domestic political context here in Mexico, including orientations of the government policies, impact on the country's position in regional fora. Okay, as I mentioned before, it is the only the only public session of this 2 days workshop, and I'm mentioning all those things for the general public who do not participate in those 2 days of very, very interesting discussions in the workshop. 3.5 years ago, Tanja Börzel and Thomas Risse from the Free University of Berlin were here at the Colegio to present what was then a new cluster initiative, a new research project entitled Contestations of the Liberal Script. I'm sure that they have come a long way since then. I know that today most of you have, and tomorrow you will also be discussing thoroughly in a workshop the papers that have been prepared on the topics that interest us this afternoon. I understand that in this public session, some of you will offer a very concise overview of the general project and of specific issues related to democracy, populism, and regional governance in Latin America. I received, now that we're talking about scripts, I received 2 scripts about how to lead this public session, and I will stick to the first script that I received. So basically the dynamic will be, I will first ask Tanja Börzel from the Free University Berlin to set the context of the presentations, and then I will ask Rafael, Ioris, Hans-Jürgen to talk about democracy, Hans-Jürgen Puhle to talk about populism, and I will ask also Cristiane de Lucena, Carneiro, and Giovanni Agostinis to talk about regionalism. But without saying more, I will now pass the microphone to Tanja for a general introduction. Tanja, please.
Thank you. Yes, excellent. Thank you so much, Jean-François. It's always a pleasure to sit on a panel with you. My script says that I'm supposed to give a brief introduction to the cluster of excellence, Contestations of the Liberal Script, and then situate the three themes of this roundtable in the overall framework of the cluster in about 5 minutes. There is no way that I can accomplish, can I really enact that script in the way I would like to. It's been a very long day. I realize we discussed 11 papers, and we have, I think, 14 more to come tomorrow. So I realize that you've been working hard today. So I'll try to really be brief. Make my best, also set an example for the other panelists, so that we at least have some time, hopefully, for comments and questions from the audience. Okay, Contestations of the Liberal Script. It is how shall I say, not a very elegant title for a cluster of excellence. But if there's one thing I learned about this cluster of excellence, which is a 7-year research center with a theme, 2 times renewable, so this can go on for altogether 21 years, right? If I learned one thing about putting together such a gigantic project, it's all about negotiations and compromise. So this title, and I spare you the history of this title, suffice to say it is sort of the essence of 3 years of preparatory discussions for this grant proposal, which we then successfully submitted in 2018 and was approved at the end of 2018, and then we started in 2019. So what is this Contestations of the Liberal Script about? I mean, the liberal script is essentially a way of bringing together, it's a set of assumptions, both prescriptive but also descriptive about how a society should be organized, right? So this is what, and of course it's liberal ideas and institutions of how a society is organized. So the question then is, what is liberal? Now again, I could talk about that for a long time, and it's still a contested concept. Suffice to say that what the essence of liberal and any liberal script or variety of the liberal script is really about individual self-determination and collective self-determination. There's a tension between the two. And the way in which this tension is negotiated and resolved then gives rise to varieties of the liberal script. So we do not insist that there is one particular liberal script that is contested. There are, of course, varieties of the liberal script, both historical and spatial. And of course, there are also varieties and contestations of the liberal script. But what we start from is an observation that the varieties of the liberal script that exist today are increasingly contested, right? And when we started off in 2016 putting together the grant proposal, we thought the major contested came from outside liberal societies. The rise of China, Russia, well, you know, we're back with Russia as an external contestant, yes, but then the Islamic State. So it was mostly about contestants that came from outside liberal society. This has completely changed at the latest with Donald Trump in 2016, right? When for the first time a sort of almost self-declared illiberal became elected president of the sort of leading liberal power of the world. That, I wouldn't say it came as a shock, but it changed a little bit our research focus from, China and Russia. Again, we're back to Russia, but Islamic State, and now focusing more on contestant within liberal societies. And the one contestant that emerged as the primary contestant is the rise of populism, right? I mean, and so we've been very occupied with the rise of populism, and you may even argue that we've been very Eurocentric in that regard, but it's not only in Europe we see the rise of populist leaders. I mean, that's at least the assumption we have, right? That it is a global phenomenon, that the contestations of the liberal script is not confined to the so-called West, which has anchored the liberal script for a long time, not exclusively written the liberal script. There's a lot of co-authorship, particularly by Latin America, but it has at least anchored the liberal script for a long time. So it is a crucial case in a way, right? I mean, if even within liberal societies that have been enacting the liberal script for a long time, the liberal script is increasingly contested, you may want to ask yourself what is going on. And again, it's not in Europe, it's the US, it is Israel, it is India, it's been Japan. So we can, and it's of course a lot of Latin American countries. So in a way, it seems that Latin America fits into the global contestation of the liberal script. Now, is that so though? We had a first day, this is why we have these regional conferences. We go to the regions and we want to explore with experts from the region and also experts from outside the region on the region to what extent the liberal script is contested, by whom, why, and to what effect. So this is why we're fortunate to be here. And now, I'll resist the temptation to summarize the discussion of today, but let me say that I think there are interesting similarities, but also important differences with regard to the way the liberal script and its varieties are contested in Latin America. So yes, we do have these populists, and then we can argue about how we want to call them: far right, radical right, extreme, authoritarian, I don't care. But I mean, I think what they have in common is this populist streak. So you have the Bolsonaros, you have the Duques, we can go through them. What is interesting is that they have arrived a little bit later here, or then not arrived, but sort of risen a little bit later than, say, in Europe, for instance, and in the US. So there is a certain delay here. And the question then is, why is that? We've talked a lot about. And then there's another difference, that these contestants, we would all consider them illiberal contestants of the liberal script. They actually use liberal language to contest the liberal script, which is very different from the Orbans of the world, who clearly say that they actually, they advocate an illiberal script of democracy. They're very open about that. They don't pretend to believe in liberalism, right? They're anti-liberal, they're illiberal. And also the Moody's of the world, who essentially argue that liberalism is a Western concept, and they sort of reject the liberal interpretation of what democracy is all about. So I think in that regard, there is an interesting difference. That was the first lesson. Then there is a left backlash against this rise of authoritarian populism, mostly driven on the right? So, I mean, we talked a lot about how this far right, the rise of the far right, is a backlash against the pink tide 1.0, but at the moment it almost seems to be now we're seeing a pink tide 2.0, right? So, and that again is very different from particularly Europe, where the left has somehow disappeared. There is no left to speak of that could actually push back on, these authoritarian right-wing or far-right contestations of the liberal script. So I think this is a very important point. So the question, why is that? Why is there still a left? And actually a quite forceful left that is able to win elections, right? Why is that? And thirdly, there is the role of regionalism. So we have 2 sessions tomorrow that are fully dedicated on regionalism and regional governance. So there's nothing I can report on, but I read the papers, and I think, again, I'll give you in a second my take on what the relationship between democracy, populism, and regionalism in Europe, because that's my area of expertise. But I mean, let me start by saying that the role of regionalism in the contestation of the liberal script is much more ambivalent as compared to Europe. Because here regionalism is, on the one hand, a way to contest the liberal script, but not in different ways. On the one hand, to sort of rewrite the liberal script progressively, right? But on the other hand, also to rewrite the liberal script regressively. So this is there is an interesting question, and the question is on what does it depend, how the regionalism is used in relation to contestations of the liberal script. So, to conclude, how I see these three different concepts, right? Democracy, populism, and regionalism. How do they relate to each other? This is, I think, is the key issue of this panel, and Thomas will be the one then to summarize what we have learned. The way it connects in Europe is essentially that way. Regionalism for the longest time was seen as an anchor for democracy. Right? So think about the European Union and the way overcoming our past, the Second World War, the Holocaust. So it was a liberal project. Now, over the past 20 years, European regionalism is increasingly seen not as an anchor, but as a threat to democracy, right? Facilitating globalization, we talked about the socio-economic, the cultural, and the political, and the European Union is all of the above, right? It fosters neoliberalism, it brings all these cosmopolitan values, and it is all about non-majoritarian institutions, not democratically accountable enough. So here you go. The European Union has become a problem, even a threat to democracy. According to the populists, they have been thriving on that, right? So the populists use regionalism as a target, arguing it is the threat to democracy. So this is the story I offer on Europe, and now I'm looking forward to learn about how things play out in Latin America.
Okay, thank you, Tanja, for your very enthusiastic presentation of the project. Now I will ask, so thank you for your very enthusiastic presentation of the project. Now I will ask Rafael Ioris from the University of Denver to address again the issue of democracy in Latin America. Is it really the end of a democratic respite? Or is it an adjustment phase of the post-transition political and representative system? Please.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity once again, and thank you for all the organizers of this event. I think it's absolutely timely gathering to reflect on challenges that, of course, go beyond Latin America, as Tanja just showed us, but certainly are acutely felt in our region. I am based in the United States, but of course I am deeply Latin American, interested and from Latin America. So in that sense, I very much come to this feeling that we need to work together these things, and this synergy is what I think can help us to think about challenging issues. In my view, the current democratic landscape of Latin America, which is kind of what I wanted to briefly share a few notes, is defined by old as well as new complex dynamics. Clearly, democratic challenges are not new to Latin America. I mean, it's a challenge to share ideas here to experts on this, but if I may, I think much of our scholarship from different disciplines, and we come from different disciplines, one of the strengths of this meeting is the interdisciplinary aspect of it. Much of our scholarship in different disciplines has been focused on the challenges and recurring challenges, continuing challenges for democratic stability, democratic governance, democratic rule, democratic consolidation in the region. Interestingly, until recently, starting from the 90s, but especially in the 2000s, it seemed that Latin America was living through one of its most promising moments for democratic consolidation. But once again, in our tan amada pero también tan sufrida región, nothing is easy, nothing is smooth. So we are where we are today. I think much of what the situation today, it was built on the throes of complex factors. As I said before, and I'm sorry for the redundancy, but this is kind of where my thinking goes for the ones that were here earlier. Achievements and shortcomings of the transition in the 90s, more acutely, presented in some countries than others, but also the whatever we could call democratic spring or pink tide or pink wave of the early 2000s. These are factors that, of course, are interfaced very closely, are intertwined even in multiple dimensions, and can only be separated for analytical purposes. On the global factors, which I think is important to kind of schematically, approach these things. I think from the 90s we saw globally, but it felt intensely in Latin America with very consequential dynamics. The end of the Cold War paved the narrative of the end of ideologies, which refocused reforms, legal, constitutional, but also economic reforms. The United States involvement in the region switched from from much more ideologically based approaches from the Cold War, the traditional logic of the Cold War, to much more economically based approach, and pressure and pave the possibility for regional elites to accept changes that were not as willing to accept before. Ironically, this was followed by decreased interest in the region in the 2000s, as we certainly should remember, which again allowed further, in new ways to democratic experimentation in the region. So it seemed that, it was kind of, with all the problems of as we discussed earlier before, and I tried to present some elements of that, the neoliberal reforms, at least institutionally, we seem to be kind of going through painful process, but, building democratic institutionality in our region. On their own, but also complementing and interfacing closely with the global events of the time, of the 90s and the 2000s, of course, we saw a series of domestic and regional factors, among which an exhaustion of autarkic attempts of economic prosperity that sort of came to an end in the 70s and the 80s with the debt crisis and so forth. And that again forced and allowed at the same time regional elites to be more open to trying something different, right, from the top. Interestingly, also was paralleled that process by a much more assertive and much more diverse, as we discussed before earlier today, levels of social mobilization from bottom up. That also, right, that bottom up interfacing, not smoothly as never is the case with that institutional framework, allow again experimentation and innovations in democratic experience. In a way, what we saw, even during the pink tide, I would claim, compared to the Cold War moments, of course, a much more moderate versions of the right, which accepted, right, the possibility of democratic life with some at least minimal levels of even socioeconomic inclusion, and also some moderate versions of the left, which all of this kind of coalesces and comes together in what is called the democratic clause of Latin America, right? The acceptance that democracy has to be the new way that Latin America has to see itself. This paved the way, along with other global transformations on the more socioeconomic aspect, what's called, the sort of the revival and the growth allowed in the 2000s and tied to the political transformations of the pink tide, which in itself combined macroeconomic stability from the 90s with some levels of social amelioration. In that sense, I would say deepening the liberal script from the left, deepening the liberal script in different ways, in the sense that universalizing Republican values and believing that other traditionally socially excluded segments of society should be allowed to participate in the citizenship, but also in the economic prosperity of those nations. Yet, this process was also deeply dependent on the commodity exports and the commodity boom of that time, which would prove to be, of course, not so stable in the long run. And in fact, when a less favorable economic condition, which started in 2008 but deepened since, and the reduction of gains from the export of primary commodities, that revealed and forced decreasing levels of tolerance among these local ruling elites, who increasingly, I would argue, come back to a zero-sum logic of the old times, regarding much more as non-acceptable, right? The tolerance was reduced, the even limited, nonetheless, absolutely historic levels of socioeconomic, political, and identitarian inclusion of traditional excluded groups. Of course, the pink tide, we usually think more on a more formal sense, but I also think, as we discussed throughout the day today, also the sense of identity and cultural inclusion that was lived by interesting social segments at this time. This economic downturn also revealed the fragility of those center-left coalitions that could no longer keep at bay a revived and re-energized conservative mobilization, globally spreading, but regionally constructed and felt, ignited by old tropes such as anti-communism, and cleverly, interestingly, disseminated by new communicational techniques, the role of social media for once in the case of many different regimes coming to power in today's landscape of Latin America. In this process, in many cases, I think this goes beyond the case of Brazil, which I study more closely, I would say, other countries include this, the anti-corruption narrative, and ever more tied to the left, provided the glue needed to coalesce very diverse, disgruntled social groups, from agrarian elites to the military to conservative religious groups, urban poor, and etc. This political activation of new, socially important, demographically speaking, but also politically activated conservative religious social segments proved to be important in this process as well as I mentioned before, again, some notes that are going to be brought back here. Media groups, new social media technologies, and lawfare techniques played important roles in this process. And in some places, there's rebranded limited idea of the armed forces as kind of the last resort for the core identity of the nation, when not the military veto openly expressed by some social segments to repress the continuation or to prevent the continuation of those center-left coalitions, proved to be important in providing this kind of erosion of crisis of democracy that we see in much of the Latin America of today. So in this process, I think in terms of its narrative and in terms of the method of implementation, it brings back at the same time old logics of authoritarian values and narratives, as well as bringing back and refuting some more possibilities of socioeconomic inclusion, which seem to be on the path, right, of becoming more present in the region in the early 2000s. And that's kind of, I think, the main elements of the landscape that we see today. So to conclude, it's a very complex scenario, if this is at all plausible to you, right, that expresses old and new dynamics. It also expresses much broader, as Tanja explained so well, better than me, a crisis of liberal democracy that has been felt structurally, globally, and I think it reflects also the limits, structural limits of old ways of political representation that are proving increasingly to be slow and unresponsive and elusive, right, to provide a sense of participating in decision-making process of people that at the click of a cell phone, right, feel that they have information that needs to be expressed and that their voice matters, which in itself should be valued, right? If we really believe in citizenship in a universal sense, people's voice should be heard. But the fact that just going to electoral processes every 4 years does not match the need and the urgency that people feel to be part of this process. So that's a much more structural, much more global limits, I think, of actually what it is, a 200-year-old model of representation. So the challenges and the elements, right, that we are living in Latin America as well go way beyond the region. But of course, our region faces, in its unique sense, I hope, Tanja, you'll leave this conference believing that it was worth coming to Latin America because it does have something unique that has to be understood, right? So the specificities of the region, I think, need to be understood within its own political history, political cultures, and political institutions, of course, in conversation with the experiences of many other countries of the world, and in an interdisciplinary perspective. And once again, I think this is combining these investigative and policy-making efforts together here, as we are doing, is an absolutely timely and relevant and hence much welcome event. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Rafael. And now I will ask Hans-Jürgen Puhle from the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University from Frankfurt to present his thoughts on that old mutant phenomenon of Latin American politics called populism. And that would be interesting if you can relate it to the discussion on democracy.
Thank you very much, Jean-François. In our work here in the cluster, we are debating not Latin American populisms as such, but with relation and with regard to its relationship with the liberal script. This doesn't work apparently.
Now it does. Okay. And I shall try to sum up the findings of my paper in a very sketchy way in the second 5 minutes I have 10 minutes. Before that, I will just try to comment on some points on the way so that you know what my approach to populism is and how I understand it. Since the beginnings, and for a long time, populisms in Latin America have been part of the liberal scripts and at the same time contestations of them. Their commonalities can be found in the various essentials of populism and in the fact that most of them belong to a particular type, project populisms in less developed countries, and that we do not look only at movements, but at established populist regimes, the classics of which have even marked a whole period in Latin America in the 20th century, more or less from the 1930s to the 1970s, in Venezuela a bit later. And I'm referring here to populisms as isms. That means distinctive movements, and not to populist elements, styles, rhetoric, propaganda, populist as an adjective, which can be used by any kind of movements from the left to the right. And if we consider populist movements, we have to define them, of course, and I will just try to do that shortly because I have no time for it. It's social movements, mobilizations of protest and resistance against the status quo in the name of the people or the common man, and not of specific classes or groups, with a corresponding ideology featuring a number of characteristics. Populists fight elites, institutions, the mechanisms of organized interest. They see themselves as a grassroots movement voicing the sentiments of just indignation against the conspiracy of a corrupt establishment or oligarchy and its foreign allies, and an illegitimate usurpation of power that should belong to the people. One of their most important ideological features is the fiction of an immediate relationship between the people and its leaders, with direct communication in two ways that does not need any intermediaries. Hence, populists antagonize and try, if they can, to circumvent and weaken all kinds of core intermediaire, which functions of control and accountability. Populists understand themselves as movements of an underdog culture. They see politics in dichotomic terms and Freund-Feind categories, and they cultivate all kinds of conspiracy narratives. They polarize and have an explicit Feindbild. It's the honest many against the corrupt few. They can be more on the right or on the left, and their relationship with democracy can be highly ambivalent. It oscillates between correctives and threats of democracy, favoring participation and de-emphasizing the liberal side of controls and accountability, damaging due procedure, producing substantial defects of embedded democracy, and often promoting authoritarian tendency. You can see that here. If you take our model of embedded democracy, populists attack particularly the partial regimes D and E, horizontal accountability and the rule of law, and also some elements of the political liberties and the public arena. If we ask ourselves, where do the Latin American populists stand? We have here the kind of classics of populists, the first archetypes. The populists in the United States were the archetype of protest populisms in more developed countries, which were then continued by the peasant and protest movements in Europe in the interwar period. And the Russian Narodniki of the same time was a prototype of populists in less developed and imperialized and dependent countries, which became the model for populist project movements in the global south, which you can see here in the African and Asian countries, which were decolonizing, but also in Latin America. The classical Latin American populisms had their great time between the 1930s and 70s, and usually have established regimes of some duration with a developmental and state interventionist, anti-imperialist agenda. They have contributed much to modernize their countries, but they also have had their limitations and their weak points, of course. I cannot go into the details here, but let me just try to introduce the subtypes. I think we have different types in Latin America. You can see that here. We have the post-revolutionary stabilizers in Mexico, in Bolivia, in Cuba, and Nicaragua, in the very short period where they remained national revolutionists before becoming Leninist. And we have the authoritarian variants, the classics, Vargas and Perón, and we have democratic populist movements in two waves. The first wave since the late 1920s and 30s, you have the some of them here in the upper in the upper part, and the second wave since the 1960s, the Demo-Christians in Chile, Venezuela, Central America, and elsewhere. Okay, I get it here. These classical regimes came to an end from the mid-1960s on. It was military dictatorships and other reasons. But nowadays, we have a resurrection of populist movements, and we have different kinds of them. We have movements with a longer tradition, as you can see here. We have new movements, and we have kinds of a mix and hybrids in Brazil and also in Mexico. I cannot go into the details, and perhaps I should just state that the developments of the new, the developments of the new movements have been intensified, and the trends to kind of a diversification of a move away from the classical typology of project populism in Latin America have been intensified by the tendencies of the last 3 decades or so of a structural change of the public sphere, which has completely changed the constellations of political communication and intermediation, and introduced new techniques of negative propaganda and of reality denial, alternative facts, outright lies, and the fundamentalization of cleavages and conflict via extensions of prejudice into belief system. Let me just give you now, finally, some short impressions of how I see the relationship between contemporary populisms and the liberal scripts. The classical constellations were that there were, in the 20th century, many overlaps of populist aspirations with key elements of the Latin American liberal scripts, and that had to do with the characteristic, on the one hand, of the liberal script in Latin America, and on the other hand, with the characteristics of the populisms. The liberal scripts in Latin America, I think, were characterized by their malleable institutional designs, their anti-imperialist bias, consent on demands for more collective self-determination, and their constant conduciveness to what one might call progressive extensions of the liberal script, reflecting the trajectories of countries and societies that have emerged out of anti-colonial struggles and have been part of the West as well as of the global South. This is very important. And we had the particular characteristics of the populist movements as project populisms, as constructive movements, which saw themselves as agents of development and self-determination. They contested the liberal scripts, mostly from the inside, and produced progressive extensions which came in waves. This classical period has ended, and now we have a kind of a diversification of Latin American populisms, which began in the late 80s, the rise of neoliberal, at times also authoritarian, later evangelical variants, and so far have culminated in the erratic dictatorship of Chavismo in Venezuela on the one hand, and the Bolsonaro regime in in Brazil on the other. While the older populisms on purpose had been more integrating, the new ones were more polarizing. And the components of populist demands that were based in regional traditions and trajectories appear to be shrinking. The share of external contestations of the liberal script has grown. And if you look at the Bolsonaro movement, it's the first bigger movement of populists in Latin America, which does no longer correspond to that kind of anti-imperialist project populism. It copies the European and the United States type of protest populism, and particularly the Trump movement. If we ask for the possible consequences of the present populist contestations for democracy and for the liberal script, I think we have to differentiate by countries. The impression might be that the populist contestations in no case will contribute to a consolidation of the liberal scripts, but that all other alternatives might apply. A progressive rewriting of the script still seems to be a possibility, I think, in Bolivia, while the cases of Venezuela and El Salvador tend towards a complete demise of the liberal script. Brazil and Mexico, I see oscillating around stagnation in a way, back and forth with only few swings to rewritings, often more retrograde than progressives. On the whole, anti-democratic versions of populism seem to be advancing in Latin America, and it might be possible that Latin America populism finally may fall for the worldwide trends towards a simple antagonism and new cleavage of authoritarian populism versus democracy, with less productive exchange between the two than before. The past trajectories of Latin American countries, however, have also taught us that it would be wise to expect also exceptions, different outcomes, and divergencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jürgen. And now, if I may, I will introduce jointly our two next panelists, Cristiane de Lucena Carneiro, de la Universidad de la USP, de la Universidad de Sao Paulo, y Giovanni Agostinis, de la Universidad, aquí lo tengo, Universidad de Bologna o la Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile, Bologna. Bien, and both of them will talk about regionalism in Latin America, trying to make the connection between what we've been discussing about contestations of the liberal script, democracy, populism, and maybe the future of regionalism in Latin America. So, Cristiane, please, you have 10 minutes.
Sure, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Anna, Thomas, and Tanja for inviting me to this roundtable. And I am going to make a few remarks which actually relate broadly to the memo that I'm presenting tomorrow. But I would like to start by going back to the point that Tanja made with respect to regionalism, European regionalism that is nowadays, right? Because unlike the EU, I would argue that regionalism in Latin America is not in tension with the liberal script necessarily, yes? So I think that's important first point to recognize. On the other hand, I also very much appreciate your point, Hans, of the malleable institutional design, right? Kind of mark of Latin American institutional evolution, if we may. Because I truly believe these two phenomena are very important for us to have a more thorough understanding of regionalism nowadays, what characterizes it, and where it's heading. That being said, I'm really raising the issues. I'm not prepared to, say much about where it is heading. And most of you should know that I am not a scholar of regionalism, but rather my research interests fall back on complexity, institutional design, eventually compliance as well. So my contribution here will center around two remarks, yes? First, the relationship between regionalism or regional governance and the liberal international order. And it might be obvious and common sense to all of us who are here throughout the day, but I think it's worth emphasizing, perhaps mostly for those who were not here with us today, that regionalism is a key component of the liberal international order. I think Tanja mentioned that, right? But in this memo, I kind of reinstate the reasons for that, right? So in a nutshell, regional organizations, they give life to economic liberalism principles. They contribute to promote liberal internationalism through the adoption of principled governance. And that could be in the realm of economic or trade liberalization. It could be in the realm of human rights, environmental protection, why not, and even security, right? So the notion of principled governance, I think, leads us right back to the key elements of the liberal international order. So I think this is another important point, to understand that regionalism is an expression of the liberal international order beyond the European project, right? So in many ways, the European model, as orchestrated as we know it today, with the democratic deficits that, you know, it's been criticized for, it's one expression of regionalism, but not necessarily the only one, right? So when we measure Latin American regionalism against the European model, I think we are imposing constraints that do not necessarily belong here. And in this memo, I will expand a little bit more on that. In Latin America, more specifically, regional governance is characterized by institutional complexity, I will argue. And complexity in a very precise manner, right? So I'm talking about complexity here in terms of overlapping institutions and perhaps also parallel institutions. And when I refer to overlapping, I mean overlapping membership as well as the juxtaposition of mandates, right? And this is not an original claim. There is published research on the topic that not only documents overlapping membership and mandates, but also, you know, has produced a very impressive and useful data set that can inform further research. So I will refer actually to one of these databases. This is the DIGO or DIGO dataset, the Death of International Governmental Organizations dataset. And according to DIGO, as I like to call it, in 2016, which is the last data point there were 47 regional organizations in the Americas, okay, so everybody, of which 8 were broad in scope, and 10 were medium in scope. Why is this important? Well, because this is where we'll find governance organizations, right? I argue. These 18 regional organizations, right, they have a high measure of overlap, again, of membership as well as mandates. And this particular feature of Latin American regionalism has always been criticized. And I take issue with that. I think we should pause to at least question whether institutional complexity is necessarily a negative phenomenon, right? And in this paper, I am looking at complexity, actually, as an instance of contestation of the liberal script. This is an argument that is very fresh and not well developed, so I'm obviously looking forward to your comments tomorrow. But the key point is that the Latin American project with respect to regionalism, constitutes a unique phenomenon, right? As such, it has distinct objectives, a particular, very particular trajectory, and its own institutional means to reach whatever goals. And I see these goals as nuanced goals and ever-changing, yes? Going back again to this point of characteristics of malleability, if the word exists, of malleable institutional design, right? So institutions responding to political demands that are constantly changing in the region, perhaps more so than in other regions, and we can explore the reasons for that. So I said I had two remarks. The second remark, which is more intuitive than anything else, is that the consequences of this institutional complexity, right, are not negative necessarily, yes? And I want to believe that they are positive, that they are advancing the liberal script in certain ways, that they are advancing a normative argument as well, right? And again, in the paper, I established a dialogue with literature that embraces that vision as well. And I should say that most scholars that look into institutional complexity within the international government organization field, they have a pessimistic view of complexity without really having analyzed it, right? Putting it to the test. I haven't done that yet, but I would like to do that. And with, helpful comments tomorrow, I would hope to strengthen that argument that the complexity that we observe and that has been a trait of Latin American regionalism amounts to a contestation of the liberal script, and that ultimately it's a positive one, it's a contestation that is advancing the democratic agenda, or even more so, the liberal agenda in Latin America. So I'll keep it short. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cristiane. Giovanni.
Has to be green on top. Has to be green. Yeah, it's green now.
Now it should work. Thank you very much. Here I am. So, okay, I would like to use my 10 minutes to discuss some of the key tendencies in contemporary Latin American regionalism and kind of provide a very preliminary discussion of what are their effects on Latin American relationship with the liberal script. So we all know that in Latin America, regional cooperation has been stagnating or even declining for some time now. And the majority of Latin American regional organizations have suffered decreasing regional collective action, which in some cases led to institutional paralysis or even institutional breakdown, such as in the case of UNASUR. So this has hampered any meaningful progress in the pursuit of collective goals across all policy areas, actually, and in the implementation of shared policies included in the mandates of these regional organizations. So actually, Tom, who is over there, argued that basically Latin America has been experiencing a de-regionalization of governance problem solving. South American, Latin American states are not using the regional level to deal with shared problems anymore and governance issues. So the inability to deal with the Venezuelan crisis was the first manifestation of this crisis, which led to the breakdown of UNASUR, of course. And then the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and again confirming the deep crisis of South American regional organizations, which were not able to provide any coherent, coordinated response. Revealing an interesting and meaningful variation between Central America and the Caribbean on the one hand and South America on the other hand. Interestingly, SICA and CARICOM, which are the two main regional organizations of Central America and in the Caribbean, respectively, have been able to respond in a coordinated manner to the pandemic and to deliver, a coherent response, much more coherent than their South American counterparts. Okay, so then we can take a look at how Latin American regional organizations have responded to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And this is also very interesting because we also, in this case, we notice a sub-regional variation. So we have SICA and CARICOM condemning Russia, shaming Russia. And on the other hand, not a single South American organization said a word of condemnation of Russia, okay? So again, something is happening there, and it tells something, I think, about Latin America's relationship with the liberal script. And of course, this is, why is this happening? And this is an open question which I'm currently dealing with, not only in Latin America, but in other, across different world regions of the global South. But yeah, it's a really fascinating, it's an interesting question. So overall, Latin American regionalism is clearly on a downslope path. And as a matter of fact, this is not new. Thousands of pages have been written on the fact that Latin American regionalism unfolds according to following a pendulum, right, pattern. So crises are followed by reactivation, political reactivation processes leading to the creation of new regional organizations or the institutional reform of pre-existing organizations. So again, what are the causes of this, constant crisis and reactivation of regionalism in Latin America? The literature identifies several factors I would like to stress, to highlight three specifically. Low economic interdependence at the intra-regional level, institutional weakness, and intergovernmentalism. So basically, these are very important features because they make Latin American regional institutions vulnerable to exogenous shocks, by which I mean crises that are not related to the regional integration process, right? So stuff that happens outside the regional organization. It can be a domestic political crisis, it can be an exogenous financial shock, a global one, etc. So, and why is this important? I think that this vulnerability to exogenous factors is relevant to explain why, especially in South America, the election of left-wing presidents in key states, right? So we have Lula now, we have Petro in Colombia, and hasn't really led so far to any reactivation of Boric, of course, in Chile, any reactivation of regionalism in South America. Of course, this is it's too early to judge. We have to see what will happen. But what I feel is that I recall in Chile, Boric's campaign team talking about the need to create, a regional production chain for lithium and a huge regional South American market to sell lithium in a more, effective way. Blah blah blah. So nothing is happening on that front, and so why? And I think that I would like to highlight four key reasons why regionalism, especially in South America, is not picking up. The first one is that there's a bleak global economic scenario. So differently from the pink tide phase and the post-hegemonic regionalism, as it has been labeled, there is no boom. There is high inflation, slowdown in the price of commodities, rising interest rates in the US and Europe, which means capital flight, or at least outflows of capital from Latin America, which means debt. Okay, it's not a good economic situation. Even more worrying is the fact that Latin America and the Caribbean have been undergoing a process of trade decoupling. So intra-regional trade, which was already low, now it's a record low, okay? We're talking about 12%. The ECLAC says that this is the CEPAL says that this is the lowest level since the 80s, okay? So second Second reason why I think this is happening, there is an increasingly conflictive multipolarity. So this results in growing preference divergence among Latin American countries because they have, it's not easy for them to pick a side, given that China is such a huge trade partner, but you are in the region of the most important liberal hegemon. ever see in the US, and so you have this, this tension which is going to grow bigger and stronger, right? Because multipolarity seems to go to be heading towards like a conflictive scenario. Then the third point is, deeper and more frequent domestic political crises. And this leads to weak leadership, presidential leadership. So you have Boric, who doesn't have time to deal with the regional level. You have Lula, who is maybe focused on other stuff, and this I can go on and on. So this is not just a domestic problem, but this is like a regional problem. It means that domestic crises in key states such as Brazil, Mexico, even Chile, for its own sake, can lead to a lack of regional leadership. And regional leadership is a key driver of regionalism in Latin America, especially. Final point, there is a ever deeper fragmentation between established democracies, illiberal democracies, or authoritarian regimes, and fragile democracies, Paraguay, Colombia, Peru, okay? Democracies which are always on the edge, on the brink of having problems. So again, how this division makes much more difficult to take positions, shared positions towards political crises, such as the one in Peru, such as the one in Nicaragua. So you see the region which is fragmented right now vis-a-vis this political crisis. Some countries are defending a given regime, others are not, etc. So how does all these final 2 minutes affect the relationship between Latin American regionalism and the liberal script? I think that in light of all this, the relationship between the region and the liberal script is likely to be ever more uneven and bumpy. It will depend on the policy area, it will depend on domestic and global constraints, political and economic and incentives, and also I think that this may possibly deepen pre-existing variation between the South America and the Caribbean and Central America. I mean, the later two may be much more aligned in the next future with the liberal order and the liberal script than South America. What are the key determinants of this scenario? I think that, again, the evolution of domestic political crises, so severe polarization, democratic backsliding, has involved big countries, Brazil, Mexico, and this is, again, it's a problem because when we know, for instance, that the functioning of democracy protection clauses depends on who is the target. Okay, so it's really difficult to target a big state, a powerful state such as Brazil and so forth. So democratic backsliding in key countries may undermine the democracy protection regime, and this is potentially a threat for democracy in the region. And the final point I would like to mention is, again, the level of political and economic conflict at the multilateral global level. So what will the region and regional organizations do when China will, I don't know, eventually invade Taiwan, or when there will be other threats to territorial integrity or democracy protection, key normative pillars of the liberal order, okay? And I think that the risk is that Latin America will be divided vis-a-vis this growing turbulences of the global order, right? So, and regionalism might not be a platform to build consensus and coordinate common positions vis-a-vis these incoming tensions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Giovanni. Now I will ask Thomas Risse, our discussant, to try to establish good connections between the topics of democracy, populism, and regionalism in Latin America. And after your brief comment, 10 minutes, more or less, I will open the session to the floor, the concrete floor and the virtual floor. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, this is, the task is impossible, number one. Okay, so I can't do this. So what I'm gonna do is, but I was scribbling like hell. I'm trying to summarize some of the stuff that I've heard, but will add some other stuff to it, and hopefully, no, not hopefully, this in 10 minutes, okay? So bear with me for a second. At scripts at the cluster, we distinguish. Too bad that Tanja didn't mention that. We distinguish between the 3 C's. Okay, the contestations, i.e., what is actually contested, the descriptive part. The second C, the causes, and the third C, the consequences. So I'm ordering my remarks according to that scheme. So let's start with the contestations. Here I need to also introduce another distinction. We need to really seriously make a difference between what one can call internal contestations of the liberal script. That is, the liberal script has all kinds of tensions. You know, one between individual and collective self-determination, between majoritarianism and minority rights, the economic script, between market economies and welfare. So I could go on for hours. None of this is problematic, and the contestations about this stuff is totally unproblematic. In fact, it is constitutive for a liberal system. A liberal system where you do not have internal contestations, I would argue, is on a really slippery slope to go down the tubes. Okay, so internal contestations as such are no problem whatsoever. They can, however, turn into so-called external contestations when certain fundamentals of the liberal script are being contested. Okay? And this is where it gets interesting, or not interesting, I mean, also scary. But so, if, for example, and I'm just mentioning a couple of things, if, for example, the independence of the judiciary is being attacked, Israel, look at Israel today, okay? 160,000 people over the weekend, actually pretty much same number as the people on Zocalo yesterday. There, the issue was the independence of the judiciary. Here, it's another potential external challenge, the integrity of the electoral process. Okay, that is how I understood what was going on the Zocalo and the rest of Mexico yesterday. So or the denial of rights. You know, there's all these. So these, when political forces start to attack these core issues, then we get to the to external contestations. For me, it's still unclear to what extent we have, quoting Rafael now, really a serious crisis of democracy. You know, because you would argue, okay, then fundamentals are at stake. I give you one. I think the US has a serious crisis of democracy at the moment. And I can give you 100 reasons for this. We just completed a book on this one. You know, I'm not so sure about where Latin America is on this, okay? Then we discussed the whole issue of populism. And populism, in my view, and Hans-Jürgen is here, and Cristobal is here, who wrote a very important book on these issues. Populism as such is ambivalent with the liberal script. Because on the one hand, you could, there's stuff that is really external to the liberal script. So if you have a very strong, how should I say, elites versus the people, you know, as if the people have only one preference, one interest. So there's attack on pluralism, etc. If you have very strong polarization, it gets pretty crazy. At the same time, and this is Cristobal's argument, that populism is actually a thin ideology. You can put in all kinds of content, you know, Marxist content, so it's all the oppressed classes versus the ruling classes, but you can also put Trumpism in there, Bolsonaroism, etc. So in that sense, it's a thin ideology. The question for me is still, in my understanding from the Latin American experience is, and that is Hans-Jürgen's point, populism was simply a simple, normal part of Latin American democracy for a very, very long time. And in fact, you couldn't win an election campaign in any country without being, to some extent, a little bit populist. I mean, so at that point, again, you don't go bananas over this, right? But it can also transform, and I understood Hans-Jürgen arguing that now you have you have these particularly mostly right-wing populist forces developing in Latin America on a broader scale, almost in the similar sense as we have seen in Europe and in the US. Now let's talk about regionalism in all of this. And it's interesting, we have two totally competing views. Yeah, I want to, not totally, but competing, I want to highlight controversy, okay? Contestation, right? So Cristiane tells us, and I think both of you agree on one thing, regionalism is an expression of the liberal international order. Yeah, and you could argue it's kind of the regional version of liberal international orders. So at that point, it should be a backing the liberal international order. Now, but we have two different descriptions. You are arguing Latin American regionalism with these overlapping institutions, functions, membership, where the literature always goes, oh my God, you know, what kind of nonsense is this? No, this is actually fine. You say it's fine. This kind of complexity is good. It actually enhances the liberal international order, and he has more the, I'd say, the traditional view, you know, and you even, you know, it's even going down the tubes even more than it used to. I mean, you could argue for a long time whether UNASUR ever did anything, or Mercosur, etc. Anyway, I don't want to go there. So that is on the descriptive part. I heard a lot less on the causes, but we got some causal arguments here. Let me start with economic issues. One big argument for the crisis of the liberal script is that there is a backlash against the forces of globalization plus neoliberalism in the sense of the Washington Consensus. That has given rise to a lot of these populist forces in Latin America, and Rafael mentioned it, the end of the commodity boom. Yeah, and you also mentioned something I mean, one here, what you call the crisis of liberalism here, because in Latin America you have a pretty low economic interdependence. You know, if you look at where the trade flows go, it's slightly different with investments, but where the trade flows go, they go mostly to the US, Europe, and China as a third. So, which then would mean, talking about regions, regions cannot serve as a regional organization cannot serve as a buffer against these forces of globalizations, and then you are really vulnerable to any kind of exogenous shocks. You know, whatever happens somewhere. On the domestic side of all of this, the argument usually is that these international forces increase economic inequalities. At the same time, in again a Latin American phenomenon, low economic growth and not much upward mobility of people. So this translates into socioeconomic exclusionary processes, and also translates into a kind of fear of status loss, mostly among white middle classes. I mean, it has been documented for the US, but also for some European countries that the votes for particularly the right-wing populist forces, mostly, I mean, one core vote is is white middle classes, male mostly, that fear some status loss. So that is on the causes. Now on the consequences. Again, I have to. Do I have a minute? No. Oh, I'm already over 10. Okay, I'll be brief. First of all, even if we, on the descriptive side, argue we are in deep crisis, that needs to be differentiated from the consequences, because this is unrelated. Yeah, it can, and Hans-Jürgen mentioned that it can simply stay there, kind of stabilize. It can go backwards, but it can also lead to some progressive rewriting, if you want, of the liberal script. Now, once again, Giovanni is pretty pessimistic that regional organization in Latin America can do anything about this, right? Cristiane probably is more optimistic, but you didn't really talk about this. My point would be, I wanted 2 points and then I'm done. We know from international norms research that violations of norms, and even big ones, like, a war of aggression, do not necessarily destroy the order. It depends what the reaction is. So, and I end with 2 questions. How strong and stable are democratic institutions in Latin America when faced with external contestations, such as the attack on the judiciary, denial of minority rights, attacks on the integrity of the electoral process? Are these how strong are these institutions and the institutional solutions? I have certain doubts here, but I'm not an expert. The other thing is the counter-mobilization. Okay, and that I'm coming back exactly to where Tanja started. Do you get counter-mobilization? Do people defend the liberal script? And there, I'm carefully hopeful. I wouldn't say more, yeah? Probably in light of what happened today in Mexico. And by the way, actually, the counter-mobilization also took place outside Mexico. You had events in the US and even in Europe in some places. So quite very, very interesting. I'll stop here. Thank you. 13 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thomas, for your very interesting comment. It's kind of an exploit to have been able to link all those topics. Now we have something like, 5 minutes to take questions or comments from the floor? Okay, so we have maybe 6 minutes now. 7. Okay, so.
Thanks a lot for the wonderful presentations. I want to comment a little on the regionalism question, because I think that in the beginning of the process of regionalization in Europe, there is something that the countries were looking for, and they were accepting losing part of their sovereignty in that moment. That was peace. And in Latin America, perhaps in South America, war is not a political instrument. There is one of the most peaceful subcontinents in the world. So perhaps it's very difficult to propose for the Brazilian government, for example, or for a Mexican government, to reduce the policy-making space in foreign policy to produce supranational institutions with countries that don't buy your products. So I think that sometimes we are importing the idea of a very beautiful project of European Union and trying to see where regionalism in other parts of the world are looking in the same way of Europe. But the demands for that in Latin America, and perhaps more important for Brazil, in South America, are different. What we need? We need some forums for intergovernmental cooperation. That sometimes there is problems that the governments need to cooperate. So UNASUR was something like that. But when the governments, they are not willing to cooperate, there is no reason for those institutions functions again. So it's probably in another 5 years from now, 10 years from now, there is much more issues for cooperating in South America. You build new institutions, or we rebuild UNASUR and put more complexity in the region. I think that I'm agreeing with the point that Cristiane make, that we need to think about regionalism, looking on what's the demands for that, for the South American countries, for the Latin American countries. Brazil and Mexico cannot be the paymaster of the region. We cannot be like Germany. Brazil, there you have a small GDP per capita than Colombia, then Argentina, then Uruguay, then Chile, then Mexico. How the Brazilian government is going to explain for the citizens, oh, we are going to pay for build more infrastructure to connect the South American region using Brazilian real money. It's not going to work. It's worked something like the Ioris project, that there was not much money, there was cooperation, technical cooperation from the Brazilian Development Bank. They were helping other countries to produce better projects, but were not giving a lot of money. So that's my comment. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Next person.
Oh, okay.
Reinaldo
Ortega from the Center for International Studies. I just tried to tackle the two questions of Thomas Rice. And one was, how strong and stable are the democratic institutions in Latin America? And I think that's one of the weaknesses of the papers that I saw in the morning and now. Putting populism as a brand name, it's very problematic. I feel that even it's a terribly bad concept which doesn't tell much. If you really want to understand causes, consequence, and description of what is going on in Latin America. And this comes very fast because putting Bolsonaro and AMLO and Duque and everyone in the same basket is not going to work in terms of descriptive causes or consequences. So I think the argument of Cristiane of putting more complexity in the regionalism would be a good advice for the other sections in terms of what is going on in terms of party politics and of what's going on in Latin America. And the other thing I think and that's more for the general project. I think even if you look just to Europe, this liberal script in Europe was surpassed maybe after the Second World War, after the welfare states was established. So I think it would be much interesting to look at Latin America more in terms of the 21st century. These are countries which are trying to build, little by little, but trying to build some kind of welfare state, which certainly goes beyond liberalism. It is part of the beyond liberalism. It's part of an old project, yeah. I mean, liberalism exists, civil rights, etc., etc. Yeah, but it certainly, this region needs much more than the liberalism of the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these interesting presentations. I'm not a specialist on populism, but after listening all this presentation today, I see the risk of a certain conceptual stretching in the sense of Sartori. In the end, we are all populists, no? Or taking the presentation of Hans-Jürgen, you gave this very broad definition, what is populism, and then in the end you say also the Constitution in Chile is populism. I do not see how, with your definition, you can capture the Constitution in Chile or also the Christian Democratic Party in Chile. This will be difficult. Then coming perhaps to the topic of regionalism, where I know a little bit more, I totally agree with Cristiane that regime complexity is not a bad thing. I've also written about this, but I think you are overselling the argument. It might, in some cases, it might be also a bad thing. And we have cases in Latin America, I think the crisis of regionalism has also to do with something with complexity. And I think in the end, you mix up two things, complexity and fluidity. I think these are different things now. There's also this concept of liquid regionalism. I think he is one of the authors of this article. And I think we have to separate the two things, the complexity and the liquidity aspect. And coming to Giovanni, I like very much your presentation. I agree with 95%. But I cannot buy your argument that the liberal script is more embedded in Central America than I buy it for trade, but when you look at human rights or democracy promotion, El Salvador, Nicaragua, it's quite difficult to buy your argument. And the last point, coming back to what Tanja said or what Thomas said, I think the discussion is a little biased. When we discuss the contestation of the liberal script, we discuss a lot of the contestators, the people contestating, but we should also include more the defenders of the liberal script to have a more equilibrated view of the topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Cristóbal?
Yes, I want to add one positive note following a bit the argument of Thomas and a negative one. The positive one, and this goes a bit to what you were saying also, Rafael, it's about the state of democracy in Latin America. And if you look at the broad picture, I think it's not that bad. I mean, think about what we're experiencing. It's the end of the commodity boom, expansion of far-right forces across the globe, the pandemic and the after effects. And if you think in the long term what is happening with democracy in Latin America, there are a couple of cases that shows you that it's still very resilient. Argentina, huge economic crisis at the end of the 90s. I mean, huge economic upheaval, social upheaval, and the country is able to recover. And even for the first time in the history of the country, you have a mainstream right party, Pro, which is able to get in power, get the Peronists out, and then hang over again to the Peronists. So a peaceful transition, I mean, with difficult problems. A country in which you wouldn't expect that 30 or 40 years ago. Think about Peru, Fujimori, collapse of the democracy, strong pressure from outside, and the country is able to recover. It's a very fragile system, but you still have free and fair elections to a certain extent. Look what is going on now. I mean, there is an ongoing process, but it's still able to a certain extent to navigate without falling into a full authoritarian regime. Think about Brazil. It was able to resist Bolsonaro. It was a nightmare for 4 years, but now you have like Lula back, and they're trying to recover the system. Ecuador and Bolivia, two countries in which you have like the very nasty version of the left, and apparently now the countries were able to get rid of that. And the only counterexamples in which they're in real problems is, of course, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and El Salvador. But again, if you look at the broad picture, it might be that we are getting too negative if you take a long-term perspective. And I think there is still like strong defense of liberal ideas and institutions. That's a positive note. The negative note, I think it has to be a bit with the left, and to what extent the left and this idea of pink tide 2.0 or whatever has been able or is able to provide a successful rewriting of the liberal script and a successful winning formula. And I think it's not able to do that. It's my feeling. So the far right is very good about selling nostalgia. Let's make America great again. Bolsonaro idea of the revival of the past and authoritarianism. But if you think about what the left is doing, we have left-wing governments in Brazil, in Chile, and in Colombia. Lula is just saying, we are safe. But which is the narrative that he's promoting about which kind of democracy we want, which is democracy in the 21st century, which are the institutions, whatever. There is nothing about that. And if you think about Colombia and Chile, there is a bit of that, but my goodness, they're not able to deliver at all. I mean, I don't think that these are going to provide like the successful model. So in this sense, that's a bit for the negative note. I don't think that the left has been able, and I don't see the minds within the left are promoting this new narrative, so to say.
Okay. No more. very, very brief answers to comments and questions.
Can I start? Or
Okay, so we can do it the other way. So we'll start with Giovanni.
Yes, very briefly. Thanks, Detlef, for this. For your comment. I totally agree with you. Central America does not comply with human rights, the protection of human rights norms, or it's not an exemplary, region in terms of, compliance with the liberal script. Yeah, I guess I was thinking of, alignment with the liberal international order, which is kind of, I think, a point that sooner or later we maybe tomorrow we will tackle, right? How these two concepts, the liberal script and the liberal international order, stay together or relate to each other. So yeah, no, fair point. And supranationality, I don't think that supranationality should be the way to go. I think that the only problem with UNASUR, and a disclaimer here, I think that UNASUR did important things. It provided a platform which was really important to deal with policy problems and so forth. The only problem with UNASUR is that they design it, the institutional design was so flawed. They could not even they did not design a democratic clause that could allow to kick out Venezuela from the bloc. This is why UNASUR, one of the main reasons why it collapsed. So I think that one thing is supranationality, the other thing is, design institutions in a way that can still protect national sovereignty, autonomy, but make it viable. Otherwise you end up with nothing, basically. So yeah.
Cristiane.
Sure. Well, thank you for the comments, and especially Detlef's comment. I think goes with the idea of perhaps proposing a research agenda. Yes, we have the data. We have refinement of the concepts involved, including the concept of complexity, since 2009 and even before, and more recently with another special edition, 2019, 2020. In my own work, I've been looking into the relationship between complexity and compliance in the realm of international human rights. And I see this agenda or the topic of regionalism as yet another possibility, yes, for us to invite our students to look in a more rigorous way. So I'm optimistic, but it's just an intuition. I think, I and some others will be able to make a contribution to that end, yes, to answer it as a question, a research question. Thank you.
Thank you. Hans-Jürgen.
Well, very briefly, Detlef apparently became puzzled by my inclusion, my cautious inclusion in parentheses of the Constitution in Chile in the lines of continuity of populist politics. I never said, nor wrote, that Constitution is a populist movement or party, because it's not a party, it's a coalition. But I see it, and because it's not a populist movement, I put it into parentheses. I see it in the line of continuities of previous populist politics on the side of the Christian Democrats, particularly. It's left-wing more particularly, and also in some kinds of reformed radicales and others, whereas the socialist part, the new socialist part of the Constitution, of course, does not have anything to do with the former socialists. It's a different thing, and there is no continuity. They come from different parts.
Thank you. Rafael.
Pues sí. So I was listening to you, and thank you, and we need to continue that conversation, but I was thinking, the first thing I was thinking is about the half full, half empty, but I actually think we need to go beyond that. I just from your own examples, of course we have the more extreme cases, but I do think there's a lot of reason to be concerned besides Nicaragua or Venezuela, but also Guatemala, Honduras. quizás Mexico. But I think that part of the problem is if we go back to this logic of, and I'm not necessarily saying you are necessarily doing that, but we all kind of go back to this minimalistic take of what the liberal script should be, while we just survive Bolsonaro, or Argentina, we survive a possible coup, or survive Cast in Chile. Then the liberal script will prove once again, which is I think that part of why we came to the situation which I think maybe it's not a crisis, but it's an erosion of the possibility of the promise of the liberal script. If you go back to kind of this minimalistic definition of what it's supposed to be, it's going to once again disappoint the populists, right? And then they will turn to alternatives either on the left or on the right. So I think we need to kind of do better. And I was trying to mention that to Andrea. You know, sadly, this is the more challenging time when the possible pink tide 2.0, whatever that is, social democracy in Latin America, maybe it's the contestation of democracy in Latin America, right? In that sense, Republican universal values. So I would like to hope that we can again, do better in that sense. And again, I think that's why we're here. So.
Okay, thank you, Rafael. Tanja asked me to say 2 words.
Okay, before I thank again everybody, let me just say 3 very bullet point comments. I cannot resist supranationalism as the cause of contestations of regionalism in Europe. Yeah, I mean, that is the discourse. But I mean, the Latin American example shows that regionalism can be contested even if it's purely intergovernmental. And so it's the purpose of regionalism rather than the authority of regional organizations. I just wanted to flag the issue. Secondly, complexity as it is, I'm fully convinced it's not a challenge to the effectiveness of regionalism, but is it a contestation? Not so sure, we're going to discuss this tomorrow. Third, the defenders of regionalism. I think this is super relevant, but it belongs to the third C, because, you know, the defenders to some extent influence to what extent the contestation of the liberal script, but the consequences it will have, right? And quite frankly, at the moment, I don't know where to put the left. Right? Is it a defender or is it another contestant? But I agree with Cristobal that I'm not very optimistic that the left will succeed in rewriting the liberal script in a way that it will stop the external contestations of the liberal script. So I'm slightly less optimistic than you guys. But that is something, I mean, I think this has been fantastic. And after this long day, right, still having such an interesting and stimulating discussion is also partly due to your brilliant chairing of the panel, Jean-François. You let the flow of the discussion go. So, thank you so much. Have the final word.
I just followed the instructions that were in the script.
You just follow the script.
Yeah, follow the script. Okay, so thank you to all the panelists, and now we can continue the discussion over a glass of wine, and we can even talk about other things.
Yes.
Thank you.
Super. Thank you. That was great.